It was a hot summer night when the boardwalk near the beach was unusually quiet. Usually by this time, the lights were bright and the usual hum of laughter and music filled the air. But tonight, everything was eerily still. The only sounds were the soft crash of waves against the shore and the occasional rustle of the wind against the palm trees. No one could really explain it, but something about that night felt off, like the air was thicker, heavier. A group of college friends, eager to break away from their campus for a weekend, had rented a small cottage right near the boardwalk. They had spent the day lounging on the beach and enjoying the attractions, but by dusk, a strange chill seemed to settle over the place. They shrugged it off as the typical summer evening breeze and decided to take a walk along the boardwalk, figuring it would be a perfect way to end the day. As they strolled, the sun dipped below the horizon and the last traces of light faded. The boardwalk was almost completely deserted now. Just a handful of tourists, but they were oddly quiet. The neon signs of arcades flickered intermittently, casting strange shadows on the wooden planks beneath their feet. The sound of their footsteps echoed louder than it should have, as if the boards themselves were too hollow, too empty. One of the friends, James, noticed something strange as they passed an old, dilapidated booth. It hadn't been in use for years, but tonight there was a flicker of movement inside. The booth, which once housed a fortune teller, had long since fallen into disrepair, with broken windows and weathered wood. But tonight, James swore he saw a figure behind the glass, a shadowy silhouette watching them. He pointed it out to the others, but when they turned to look, there was nothing there. Just an empty booth, as it had been for years. "Maybe we're just seeing things," one of them joked, trying to lighten the mood. But the uneasy feeling hung in the air, heavier now. As they walked further down the boardwalk, things began to feel even stranger. The sky, which had been clear just moments before, seemed to grow darker, more oppressive. The breeze picked up, swirling in unnatural patterns. The friends quickened their pace, eager to get back to the safety of the cottage. But then the lights began to flicker, and the sound of soft, shuffling footsteps echoed behind them. At first, they thought it was just another group of late-night revelers, but when they turned around, no one was there. Still, the footsteps continued, growing louder and closer. Panic set in. They started to run. The sound of those footsteps seemed to chase them, echoing in the still night air as though something unseen was just behind them, getting closer with every stride. They reached the end of the boardwalk and looked back, only to see a figure standing at the far end, barely visible in the dim light. Its shape was wrong, too tall, too thin, its limbs unnaturally long. The figure didn't move, but the air around it seemed to shimmer, as though it was warping reality itself. In a state of terror, they sprinted back toward their cottage, slamming the door shut behind them. But even inside, the strange, unsettling feeling didn't leave. The footsteps still echoed in their minds, and the sight of that figure loomed behind their eyes. The next morning, they decided to leave the boardwalk behind. They couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them, something that had been there long before they ever arrived. And as they packed their things, one of the friends, a girl named Emily, picked up a strange weathered coin from the ground near the cottage's door. It wasn't anything special, just a cheap, old trinket, but something about it felt wrong. She threw it away, but the feeling never left. A few months later, the group returned to the area hoping to visit the boardwalk again. But when they arrived, they were met with a strange sight. The boardwalk was gone. In its place was an empty stretch of beach. The remnants of what looked like old wooden beams and broken planks scattered across the sand. No one remembered it ever being torn down, but the town seemed to have erased it from history. And from that moment on, no one ever spoke of it again. Not the strange figures, not the eerie footsteps, not the unsettling presence that haunted them. It was as if the boardwalk had never existed in the first place, and those who dared to remember it were left with a lingering sense of dread, one that would never truly fade.
Story number 2.
It was a weekend trip, one of those last-minute decisions to escape the grind of daily life. The group of friends rented a small cabin in a secluded coastal town, a place famous for its beautiful boardwalk. They had heard the stories about the area, how it was known for being haunted, how strange things happened near the water at night, but they laughed it off. Ghost stories were a dime a dozen, and this town was no different. The first night was uneventful. They spent their time on the boardwalk, drinking, laughing, and admiring the ocean under the stars. The lights from the amusement park flickered in the distance, and the carousel's haunting melody echoed softly in the air. It was the kind of night that felt almost too perfect, like a scene out of a movie. But something gnawed at the back of one of the friends, Sarah. She had an odd sense that they weren't alone. The next evening, as the group walked back from the beach, they noticed something strange. The boardwalk was nearly empty. Most of the shops were closed, and the distant sounds of the amusement rides seemed eerily muted. Sarah lingered behind, her instincts telling her something wasn't right, but she couldn't put her finger on it. As the others continued on ahead, she looked around and saw an old man sitting on one of the benches, his face hidden by the shadow of his large, worn hat. He didn't move, just sat there, staring at the ocean. When she caught up to the group, she mentioned the man, but no one seemed to care. They brushed it off as just another odd character in a strange town, but Sarah couldn't shake the image of him. There was something in the way he sat, completely still, as if waiting for something, or someone. That night, Sarah couldn't sleep. She tossed and turned, her mind racing. Then, at the stroke of midnight, she heard it, soft, shuffling footsteps outside the cabin. She sat up in bed, her heart pounding in her chest. The footsteps grew closer, then stopped, just outside her window. She slowly crept to the window and peeked through the blinds. The old man was there, standing motionless at the base of the cabin. His face was now visible, gaunt, pale, and hollow-eyed. His gaze was fixed directly on her, as if he could see her through the glass. Frozen in terror, Sarah backed away from the window. She wanted to scream, but the words caught in her throat. The man didn't move, but his eyes never left her. Her breathing quickened as she stumbled back to the bed, desperate to hide from his gaze. Then she heard a soft whisper, so quiet it could have been the wind. But it wasn't. It was a voice, low and raspy, coming from outside the cabin. "Come closer, child." Sarah tried to ignore it, pulling the covers over her head. She told herself it was just her imagination, that she was being paranoid. But the voice didn't stop. It lingered in the air, growing louder and more persistent. "Come closer, child. I'm waiting." The next morning, Sarah told her friends what happened, but they laughed it off. They thought she was just being dramatic. But when they walked down to the boardwalk again that day, Sarah noticed something chilling. The old man was there, sitting in the same spot on the bench. But this time there was something different. His face wasn't just pale, it was almost translucent, like a ghostly figure from another time. His lips moved slowly, but no sound came out. Sarah's heart stopped as she realized his eyes were still fixed on her. "Come closer, child," the voice echoed in her mind. Panicked, Sarah grabbed her friends, dragging them back toward the cabin. She tried to explain what was happening, but no one understood. They thought she was losing it. As they left the boardwalk behind, they didn't notice the figure that followed them, always staying just out of sight. That night, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The same footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoed outside her cabin. She dared not look outside again, but the voice returned, just as it had the night before. But this time, it wasn't a whisper. It was a scream that ripped through the silence of the night, filled with a raw, bone-chilling agony. It echoed over and over until Sarah couldn't take it anymore. She bolted from her bed and ran outside, determined to confront whatever was haunting her. But when she reached the edge of the cabin, she saw nothing. No old man, no footsteps, just silence. As she turned back to the cabin, the door creaked open by itself, and there, in the threshold, stood the man. The old man with the translucent skin. His face was twisted in an expression of pure agony. He reached toward her, his bony hand extended in a slow, deliberate motion. "Come closer, child." Before she could react, the door slammed shut behind her. The last thing Sarah heard was the sound of footsteps fading away into the night, swallowed by the darkness. She never returned to the town, and no one ever saw her again. The boardwalk was abandoned shortly after, the town eventually forgotten by those who once visited. But late at night, when the winds blow just right, Some say you can still hear the shuffling footsteps on the boardwalk, followed by a voice, soft and patient, waiting for someone to come close.
Story number 3.
It was late autumn when a group of friends decided to visit a forgotten coastal town known for its ghost stories and eerie legends. The town had always been somewhat off the map, a place where locals rarely ventured after sundown, whispering about strange occurrences and things that couldn't be explained. The boardwalk was a relic from a bygone era, abandoned but still hauntingly intact. It was the perfect place for a weekend getaway, or so they thought. The group arrived in the late afternoon, and as they unpacked at their cabin near the beach, they couldn't help but notice how strange the town felt. It was almost too quiet. No one was out walking the streets, the air felt unnaturally still, and even the birds seemed to avoid the area. Still, they pushed the unease aside, eager to explore. The boardwalk was just a short walk from the cabin, and they headed there just as the sun began to set. The boardwalk, with its weathered wood and dimming lights, was like something from another time. The attractions were long abandoned, the arcade machines covered in dust, and the Ferris wheel creaked eerily in the wind as if it still longed to move. But there was no one around, not a single soul. It was as if the place had been forgotten by everyone but the wind. The group wandered aimlessly, joking nervously about the place's haunted reputation. When they reached an old, rusted gate near the end of the boardwalk, they saw a faded sign that read, "The Old Lighthouse, Do Not Enter." Naturally, curiosity got the best of them, and they pushed the gate open, stepping through to explore further. The lighthouse was perched on a cliff, its towering structure looking even more imposing in the failing light. The air grew colder, the wind picking up as they approached the door. One of the friends, Mark, pushed the heavy wooden door open with a groan. Inside, the lighthouse smelled of rot and decay, the walls covered in layers of grime. They made their way up the spiraling staircase, which seemed to creak and groan with each step, as though the building itself was protesting their presence. At the top, they found the old lantern room, a rusted beacon that no longer functioned. From the window, they could see the dark ocean stretching endlessly before them. That's when they noticed something strange. In the distance, out on the water, a single light appeared, moving slowly across the surface. At first they thought it was a boat, but it moved too steadily, too unnaturally. The light seemed to be floating, not bobbing on the waves, as though it was tethered to something beneath the surface. "That's weird," Mark said, squinting to get a better look. As they all stared, a shiver ran down their spines. The light suddenly shot toward them at an impossible speed, a jagged, erratic motion that made the air feel thick and oppressive. Then, just as quickly as it had come, it vanished. The group stood frozen, unsure of what they had seen. It wasn't until they started to leave that they realized how cold it had become. The once mild autumn air now felt frigid, as if something had shifted, something that wasn't quite right. They descended from the lighthouse and found that the boardwalk was even emptier than before, the air thick with an unsettling stillness. When they reached the cabin, they decided to call it a night. But as they settled into their rooms, a strange noise echoed from outside. It was faint at first, like the sound of footsteps on wood, slow and deliberate. They ignored it, thinking it was just the wind or the old structure settling. But the sound grew louder, closer. Mark was the first to investigate. He went outside to the porch, his flashlight slicing through the darkness. The air felt unnaturally heavy, and the footsteps, now clear as day, seemed to follow him. He swung the beam of his flashlight back and forth, but there was no one there, just the empty expanse of the boardwalk stretching out before him. Yet the sound of footsteps kept getting closer. He turned to go back inside, but that's when he saw it, a figure standing at the far end of the boardwalk, just outside the reach of the light. It was tall, gaunt, with a long coat that flapped in the wind. Its face was hidden in the shadows, but Mark felt the coldness radiating from it, felt the suffocating presence of something unnatural. The figure didn't move, just stood there, its head tilted slightly to the side as if watching him. Terrified, Mark backed away toward the cabin, but the figure began to move, slowly, relentlessly, gliding across the boardwalk as if it was floating just above the ground. Every step it took was mirrored by a faint thudding sound that echoed in Mark's chest. Panicked, he rushed back inside, slamming the door shut. The footsteps continued outside, pacing back and forth, waiting. The others woke, alarmed by the noise, but when they opened the door, nothing was there. No figure, no footsteps, just the empty boardwalk bathed in an eerie silence. The night dragged on, each of them unable to sleep, haunted by the sensation of being watched. The next morning, they decided to leave the town, convinced it was cursed. As they packed their things, Mark glanced out the window one last time, and for a brief moment, he saw the figure again, standing on the boardwalk, staring back at him. They never spoke about what happened that night, not even when they got home. The memory of the figure, the footsteps, and that cold, unshakable presence stayed with them, lurking in the corners of their minds. And whenever they passed a lighthouse or stood near the water, they couldn't help but wonder if that figure was still out there, waiting for the next group of curious souls to wander too close.
Story number 4.
The boardwalk was always quiet at night. No one really understood why people stayed away, but locals would say it was because of the old carnival. It had been abandoned for years, the rides rusting, the games decaying, and the lights long gone. But once, it had been the heart of the town, a place where families and tourists came to have fun, laugh, and enjoy the attractions. The carousel, the Ferris wheel, and the funhouse had all been vibrant with life until something happened, something that no one ever spoke of. A young woman, Claire, had heard the rumors before. She came to the town alone, hoping to escape her mundane life for a weekend of solitude. She had heard the strange whispers from the locals about the boardwalk, but they seemed more like urban legends than actual truths. So when she arrived, she decided to take a walk to explore the place. The evening was cool, the sky tinged with fading pinks and purples, and the air carried a crisp breeze off the water. As she approached the boardwalk, she noticed something odd. The boardwalk was dark, yes, but not in the way she expected. It wasn't just the absence of lights. It was like the very atmosphere felt hollow, like the place had been drained of energy. She could almost hear a distant hum of voices, faint laughter echoing in the distance, but no one was there. It was as if the town had forgotten the boardwalk ever existed, yet it still existed in some strange, forgotten corner of the world. Claire hesitated for a moment, but her curiosity got the better of her. She walked down the wooden path, the planks creaking under her feet. The first thing that caught her eye was the carousel. It was covered in dust, the horses frozen in mid-motion, their eyes wide and lifeless. But what struck her most were the lights. Though they were dull, they still flickered faintly, as though something was trying to wake them up. Her skin prickled as the hum of voices grew louder. She could swear she heard a child's laugh echoing faintly through the air. A chill ran down her spine, and she took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves. The Ferris wheel loomed ahead, its massive frame casting long shadows across the boardwalk. Claire knew that it had been years since it last turned, yet the sight of it, standing still, and yet somehow alive with a strange, eerie energy, unsettled her. She felt drawn toward it, like something was pulling her closer. As she reached the base of the wheel, she looked up and saw movement at the top. A silhouette, a figure. At first, she thought it was just her imagination. Perhaps the wind had shifted something, or the shadows were playing tricks. But no, there was definitely someone, or something, standing at the top of the Ferris wheel, watching her. Her breath caught in her throat, and she stepped back, suddenly aware of how alone she was. She turned to leave, but as she did, she heard a sound behind her, footsteps, soft but deliberate, following her down the boardwalk. She quickened her pace, glancing over her shoulder, but no one was there. The footsteps continued, closer now, right behind her. Her heart pounded in her chest, and her legs felt like they were made of lead. She wanted to run, but her body wouldn't obey. The footsteps grew louder, and then, just as she reached the end of the boardwalk, a figure emerged from the darkness ahead. It was a man, tall, with a hood obscuring most of his face. He stood perfectly still, his hands at his sides, his posture unnervingly rigid. His presence was like a weight in the air, heavy and suffocating. Claire tried to speak, to ask if he needed help, but the words caught in her throat. The man didn't move, didn't speak. He simply watched her, his head tilted slightly to the side, as if waiting. Claire took a step back, then another, her breathing shallow and erratic. The figure didn't budge, but she could feel his eyes, cold, empty, and knowing, locked onto her. She turned and began to run, her feet pounding the wooden planks as she heard the faint sound of his footsteps echoing behind her, keeping pace with her frantic escape. The hum of voices grew louder, and now she could make out words, twisted and garbled like a broken record. Just as she reached the end of the boardwalk, she dared to glance over her shoulder. The figure was gone. She stopped, gasping for air, her heart racing. The boardwalk was empty again. The hum of voices had disappeared, and everything was still. But when she looked down, she saw something that made her blood run cold. A small rusted key lay on the ground at her feet, half buried in the sand. She picked it up hesitantly, feeling its cold weight in her palm. The moment she touched it, the boardwalk seemed to shift, like the air itself was changing. The distant sound of the Ferris wheel turning slowly began to fill the air, its creaking gears shifting into motion, even though no one was there to ride it. Then, just as quickly, the sound stopped. Claire ran back to her cabin, not looking back once. That night, she could hear the faint hum of the carnival in her dreams, the laughter, the whispers, the scraping of the Ferris wheel as it moved slowly in the dark. And as the days passed, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was following her, something that had been waiting for her to find that key. And though she tried to leave the town the next morning, the moment she stepped into her car, the strange hum of the carnival reached her ears once more. But this time, she could hear something else too. A faint voice, whispering her name, calling her back.
Story number 5.
The town had always been known for its picturesque boardwalk, a place where families would gather, kids would ride the carousel, and the smell of cotton candy lingered in the air. But that was before the accidents, before the disappearances, before the rumors spread like wildfire. No one went near the boardwalk after dark anymore, not unless they were willing to face the shadows that seemed to cling to the place, waiting for something or someone. Lena, an adventurous young woman with a penchant for the unusual, didn't believe in ghost stories. She'd heard the whispers from the locals, the warnings to stay away, but to her, they were nothing more than old wives' tales meant to scare tourists. She was only in town for a short stay, visiting a friend who had recently moved to the area, and she had decided to explore on her own one evening. Her friend had begged her to stay away from the boardwalk, but Lena was determined to see what all the fuss was about. By the time Lena reached the boardwalk, the sun had already set. The once vibrant colors of the carnival rides and the games had faded, replaced by an unsettling stillness. The lights above flickered sporadically, casting strange shadows that seemed to move on their own. The wind howled between the creaking wooden planks, making the entire place feel like it was alive, like it was waiting. Lena's footsteps echoed on the boards as she walked down the path, her breath visible in the cold night air. There were no other souls in sight, no sounds of laughter or chatter. It was as if the entire town had turned its back on the boardwalk. As she neared the old funhouse, something caught her eye, a movement in the reflection of the broken mirrors. At first, she thought it was just the wind or a trick of the light, but as she stepped closer, she saw a figure in one of the mirrors. It was a woman, standing perfectly still, staring at her with eyes that were far too wide, too empty. Lena froze, her pulse quickening. She turned around, but there was no one behind her. The wind picked up again, and the mirrors rattled as if something unseen was pushing against them. The hairs on the back of Lena's neck stood up. She was about to turn and leave when she heard it, soft at first, like the sound of something scraping against wood. Slowly, deliberately. Then a whisper, low and hushed, like someone speaking just behind her ear. "Don't leave yet!" Lena's heart skipped a beat. She whipped around, but there was still no one in sight. The sound of the scraping grew louder, closer. It was coming from the carousel. With a mix of dread and curiosity, Lena made her way toward it, the wooden horses swaying slightly in the wind, their painted eyes gleaming in the dim light. The carousel wasn't moving, but something about it felt wrong, like it was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. She stepped closer, her footsteps echoing in the silence, and that's when she saw it. A figure, standing at the center of the carousel. It was tall, gaunt, its face hidden in shadows. Its hands were long and skeletal, its fingers curled unnaturally as though it was grasping something in the air. The carousel's lights flickered again, casting eerie patterns on the ground. The figure turned its head toward her, and Lena's blood ran cold. Its face was obscured, but she could see the glint of something in its eyes, something that wasn't human. Then, without warning, it stepped off the carousel, its long, spindly legs moving unnaturally fast. Lena took a step back, her heart racing. She spun around to run, but as she did, she noticed something else. The path behind her, the one she had walked to get here, had changed. It was darker now, the shadows deeper, as if the boardwalk had rearranged itself while she wasn't looking. She turned again, trying to make sense of her surroundings, but she couldn't remember where she'd come from. The scraping sound was back, louder now, followed by a voice, screeching, desperate, and full of anguish. "Stay with me." Lena broke into a sprint, her breath ragged as she ran down the path, hoping to find the exit. But no matter how far she went, the boardwalk stretched on endlessly, as if it was twisting and shifting beneath her feet. The whispers grew louder, the voices now a chorus, all of them pleading with her, calling her name, begging her to stay. Just as she thought she couldn't run any longer, she stumbled into the funhouse again. The mirrors warped and bent around her, reflecting distorted images of herself. Her face was twisted, her eyes hollow, her expression not her own. The figure was there again, standing behind her, its mouth moving as it whispered her name. "Don't leave yet." Lena spun around, her chest tight with panic. The figure's face was inches from hers now, its cold breath on her skin. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. The figure's lips curled into a twisted smile, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth. In that moment, Lena understood. The boardwalk wasn't abandoned. It was waiting. Waiting for the next lost soul to wander in. And once you did, once you stepped into its grasp, there was no leaving. The boardwalk would change the paths, warp the reality around you, until you were too far gone to escape. The last thing Lena heard before the world around her faded was the sound of the carousel starting up again, the music playing a haunting, broken melody as the figure's laughter echoed through the air.
Story number 6.
The town had always been known for its picturesque boardwalk, a place where families would gather, kids would ride the carousel, and the smell of cotton candy lingered in the air. But that was before the accidents, before the disappearances, before the rumors spread like wildfire. No one went near the boardwalk after dark anymore, not unless they were willing to face the shadows that seemed to cling to the place, waiting for something or someone. Lena, an adventurous young woman with a penchant for the unusual, didn't believe in ghost stories. She'd heard the whispers from the locals, the warnings to stay away, but to her, they were nothing more than old wives' tales meant to scare tourists. She was only in town for a short stay, visiting a friend who had recently moved to the area, and she had decided to explore on her own one evening. Her friend had begged her to stay away from the boardwalk, but Lena was determined to see what all the fuss was about. By the time Lena reached the boardwalk, the sun had already set. The once vibrant colors of the carnival rides and the games had faded, replaced by an unsettling stillness. The lights above flickered sporadically, casting strange shadows that seemed to move on their own. The wind howled between the creaking wooden planks, making the entire place feel like it was alive, like it was waiting. Lena's footsteps echoed on the boards as she walked down the path, her breath visible in the cold night air. There were no other souls in sight, no sounds of laughter or chatter. It was as if the entire town had turned its back on the boardwalk. As she neared the old funhouse, something caught her eye, a movement in the reflection of the broken mirrors. At first, she thought it was just the wind or a trick of the light, but as she stepped closer, she saw a figure in one of the mirrors. It was a woman, standing perfectly still, staring at her with eyes that were far too wide, too empty. Lena froze, her pulse quickening. She turned around, but there was no one behind her. The wind picked up again, and the mirrors rattled as if something unseen was pushing against them. The hairs on the back of Lena's neck stood up. She was about to turn and leave when she heard it, soft at first, like the sound of something scraping against wood, slowly, deliberately. Then a whisper, low and hushed, like someone speaking just behind her ear. "Don't leave yet." Lena's heart skipped a beat. She whipped around, but there was still no one in sight. The sound of the scraping grew louder, closer. It was coming from the carousel. With a mix of dread and curiosity, Lena made her way toward it, the wooden horses swaying slightly in the wind, their painted eyes gleaming in the dim light. The carousel wasn't moving, but something about it felt wrong, like it was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. She stepped closer, her footsteps echoing in the silence, and that's when she saw it. A figure standing at the center of the carousel. It was tall, gaunt, its face hidden in shadows. Its hands were long and skeletal, its fingers curled unnaturally, as though it was grasping something in the air. The carousel's lights flickered again, casting eerie patterns on the ground. The figure turned its head toward her, and Lena's blood ran cold. Its face was obscured, but she could see the glint of something in its eyes, something that wasn't human. Then, without warning, it stepped off the carousel, its long, spindly legs moving unnaturally fast. Lena took a step back, her heart racing. She spun around to run, but as she did, she noticed something else. The path behind her, the one she had walked to get here, had changed. It was darker now, the shadows deeper, as if the boardwalk had rearranged itself while she wasn't looking. She turned again, trying to make sense of her surroundings, but she couldn't remember where she'd come from. The scraping sound was back, louder now, followed by a voice, screeching, desperate, and full of anguish. "Stay with me." Lena broke into a sprint, her breath ragged as she ran down the path, hoping to find the exit. But no matter how far she went, the boardwalk stretched on endlessly, as if it was twisting and shifting beneath her feet. The whispers grew louder, the voices now a chorus, all of them pleading with her, calling her name, begging her to stay. Just as she thought she couldn't run any longer, she stumbled into the funhouse again. The mirrors warped and bent around her, reflecting distorted images of herself. Her face was twisted, her eyes hollow, her expression not her own. The figure was there again, standing behind her, its mouth moving as it whispered her name. "Don't leave yet." Lena spun around, her chest tight with panic. The figure's face was inches from hers now, its cold breath on her skin. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. The figure's lips curled into a twisted smile, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth. In that moment, Lena understood. The boardwalk wasn't abandoned. It was waiting. Waiting for the next lost soul to wander in. And once you did, once you stepped into its grasp, there was no leaving. The boardwalk would change the paths, warp the reality around you, until you were too far gone to escape. The last thing Lena heard before the world around her faded was the sound of the carousel starting up again, the music playing a haunting, broken melody as the figure's laughter echoed through the air.
Story number 7.
The small beach town had always been a quiet place, the kind of town where everyone knew everyone, and no one locked their doors at night. The boardwalk, which stretched along the shoreline, was its centerpiece, an old relic from a time when the town had thrived as a tourist destination. Now, though, it stood mostly deserted, the carnival rides long rusted and the boardwalk itself worn from years of salt and storms. Maggie had grown up in that town. As a child, she spent every summer walking the boardwalk with her friends, enjoying the sweet, sticky smell of caramel apples and the laughter of tourists. But after years of neglect, the once vibrant boardwalk had taken on a new, unsettling energy. The rides that used to sparkle in the daylight now loomed in the darkness like abandoned ghosts. And the locals, older now, no longer went near the place after sunset. It was late one October evening when Maggie returned to her hometown, now an adult, for the first time in years. Her visit was meant to be brief, just a quiet weekend to see family, but there was a part of her that missed the nostalgia, the sounds, the smells, the memories. So despite the warnings, she found herself back on the boardwalk alone, walking down its familiar path as the ocean breeze brushed past her. At first, it felt like old times. The boardwalk stretched endlessly ahead, the faint sounds of the waves crashing against the shore in the distance. But as she wandered further, the air seemed to grow colder. The lights above flickered, and the ground beneath her feet seemed to creak in strange, rhythmic patterns. Maggie shook it off, blaming the chill on the wind. But something was off. The boardwalk was too quiet. There were no other people. The only sound was the occasional squeak of an old sign swinging above her. As she passed the old photo booth, where she had taken countless pictures as a child, she heard a soft, unsettling sound coming from behind it. It was a low, dragging noise, like something heavy being dragged across the wooden planks. Her heart began to race. She didn't want to look. She told herself it was just a stray animal, or maybe the wind again. But her feet betrayed her, and she found herself stepping around the booth to investigate. At first, there was nothing, just the shadows cast by the dim light, the scent of salt water in the air. But then, she saw it. In the corner, just beneath the photo booth, was a pair of old shoes, worn, covered in dirt, and sitting oddly still. Maggie's breath caught in her throat. She was about to turn away when the noise came again, louder this time. A dragging, scraping sound as if something or someone was slowly pulling itself along the boardwalk. Her eyes darted toward the shoes, and in that instant, they shifted. They moved. The shoes slid toward her slowly, as if they were being dragged by invisible hands. Maggie's legs froze, her mind screaming at her to run, but she couldn't move. She watched in frozen terror as the shoes continued to shift closer, and then, just as they reached her feet, a figure emerged from the shadows. It was a man. At least, it looked like a man. He was hunched over, his body bent at an impossible angle, his skin pale and taut over bone. His face was barely visible beneath the hood, but his eyes, those eyes were wide, too wide, with dark, hollow sockets staring at her as if he could see straight through her. He moved toward her with a slow, deliberate crawl, his hands gripping the ground in front of him, dragging his body along the boardwalk. Maggie stumbled backward, her heart pounding in her chest. The man's lips moved, but no sound came out. He was muttering something unintelligible. His fingers scraped against the wood with a sickening noise as he continued to inch closer, closer. With a sudden surge of fear, Maggie turned and ran. She didn't look back, even as the sound of his dragging feet grew louder behind her. Her breath was ragged, her legs burning with the effort of running down the endless boardwalk, but it felt like the end kept moving farther away. Every time she thought she saw an exit, a light, a way out, the boardwalk stretched even further, twisting and elongating before her. She could still hear him, his dragging steps following her, getting closer with each passing second. The laughter, the joy, the memories, all seemed to fade into the background as the boardwalk became a prison, one she couldn't escape. Finally, she spotted the end of the boardwalk up ahead, a faint light shining through the mist. She pushed herself harder, her legs aching, her chest tight with fear. But as she neared the end, she realized with a sinking feeling that the light wasn't getting any closer. The boardwalk was endless. It was looping, bending back on itself in ways that defied logic. The man's voice came again, louder now, distorted and crackling, like it was coming from a broken radio. "You can't leave," it whispered. "You belong to the boardwalk now." Maggie's heart dropped. She stopped running, her body trembling with exhaustion and fear. There was no way out, no escape. And then, before she could react, the figure was there, standing in front of her. His hands, long and skeletal, reached out to grab her. He wasn't dragging himself anymore. He was standing tall, grinning with a mouth full of sharp, broken teeth. The man's body twisted unnaturally, his neck jerking to the side as his wide eyes locked onto hers. "You belong here now," he whispered again. Maggie screamed, but no sound left her lips. The world around her began to distort, the boardwalk bending and warping as if it was swallowing her whole. And just like that, everything went dark. The next morning, the boardwalk was empty, silent as always. The only sign that anything had happened was the faint imprint of shoes in the sand, dragging across the ground toward the pier, fading into the fog. The locals never spoke of Maggie again, and the boardwalk remained as it always had, abandoned, forgotten, waiting for the next soul to wander in.
Story number 8.
The sun had just set, casting an orange glow over the waves. The beach town was quiet as always, but there was something different in the air that evening. For some reason, there was an unsettling tension in the breeze, a feeling that clung to the edges of the boardwalk as Amelia walked along its worn planks. She had visited this town every summer as a child, and the boardwalk had always felt like a magical place. The kind where memories were made, where time seemed to slow down, and where she could feel the salty breeze in her hair. But now, as an adult, Amelia noticed the change. The boardwalk had fallen into decay. The lights along it flickered, the benches had chipped paint, and the sound of the sea, which had once been soothing, now felt oppressive. Still, it was a quiet, peaceful night, and Amelia needed the walk to clear her head. She had come back to visit her old friend Jenny, but Jenny had gone to bed early, leaving Amelia to wander alone. Amelia was lost in her thoughts when she heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind her. She stopped, glancing over her shoulder, but there was no one there. Just the dark, empty stretch of boardwalk, the distant hum of the ocean in the background. She dismissed it as her mind playing tricks, a result of being tired from the long drive, but the footsteps continued. Slow, deliberate steps echoing in the night. They weren't quick, like someone trying to catch up to her. They were measured, almost as if someone was walking at the exact pace she was. Her heart raced. She turned around again, this time more quickly, but still, no one was there. The boardwalk remained empty, the streetlights casting long, eerie shadows on the sand. Just nerves, she muttered to herself, trying to reassure herself. She continued walking, trying to ignore the feeling of being watched. But the footsteps grew louder. The sound of someone walking in time with her, just behind her left shoulder. Her skin prickled. She felt a cold gust of wind blow through her hair, even though there had been no wind just moments ago. Her breath caught in her throat. Something was wrong. She stopped, spinning around quickly, her heart pounding, but there was no one. Only the empty stretch of boardwalk, no footsteps, no presence. Then, as if to mock her, the sound of the footsteps started up again, closer this time. Not behind her, but from ahead, just around the corner. Amelia's legs froze. She didn't move, didn't even breathe for a moment. The sound grew louder and closer, now unmistakable, slow, measured, deliberate footsteps, as though someone was approaching from the darkness up ahead. Something deep inside Amelia told her to run, but she couldn't move. She was paralyzed, her feet glued to the boardwalk. She couldn't tear her eyes away from the spot where the footsteps were coming from. And then, as she stared into the shadows ahead, a figure emerged. It was tall, wearing a long, dark coat, and its features were hidden by the brim of a wide, shadowy hat. Amelia could only make out the shape of it, tall and gaunt, its silhouette stretching far too thin against the dim light. The figure didn't walk toward her. It seemed to glide. No movement of legs, no swaying of arms. It simply drifted forward as if the ground didn't matter. The eerie sound of footsteps, though, kept pace, each step hollow and echoing along the empty boardwalk. Amelia couldn't look away as it approached, closer, closer. Her breath hitched when it stopped just a few feet from her. The air grew colder in an instant, and a feeling of dread enveloped her. The figure did not speak. It just stood there, its dark eyes hidden beneath the shadow of the hat, but Amelia felt those eyes on her, as though they were piercing through her very soul. "Who are you?" Amelia whispered, her voice trembling despite her attempt to stay calm. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it raised one long, bony hand and pointed down the boardwalk, further into the darkness, toward the farthest end where the boardwalk disappeared into a maze of overgrown trees. Amelia's heart raced as she felt a coldness grip her chest. A heavy weight, something ancient and inexplicable, pressed against her. It was then that she realized the boardwalk wasn't empty. It wasn't abandoned. There were people, others, trapped, wandering the dark stretches, waiting to be called. They were always there, hiding in plain sight, waiting for the next person to come along, to hear their footsteps and be drawn into the darkness. The figure slowly tilted its head, its hidden face now more visible, though it was not human. Its skin was pale, stretched too tightly, and its mouth was wide, far too wide for any person to have. It opened its mouth, and from deep within, a voice echoed, low, gravelly, almost mechanical. "You're not leaving. Not yet." A cold, unnatural wind whipped around Amelia as the figure took a step forward, gliding ever so closer. With each step, the world around her began to distort. Trees swayed unnaturally, shadows stretched and twisted. The boardwalk seemed to shift beneath her feet, like it was changing its shape, and just like that, the feeling of the boardwalk changed. It was no longer familiar. It was something else entirely, something dark, something ancient. Amelia could feel herself being pulled, her feet lifting from the ground, as if the boardwalk itself was trying to drag her into the shadows, to take her down into the depths of the dark, endless expanse. In that instant, Amelia screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the vast emptiness that surrounded her, and as the figure's bony hand reached out, the world went black. No one would find Amelia. No one would hear her scream, and the boardwalk, it would remain, empty, still, waiting for the next wanderer to step foot upon it, to hear the footsteps behind them, to follow the whispers into the unknown.
Story number 9.
There was a small town by the sea, one of those places where the fog never seemed to lift, and the air always felt damp, no matter the season. The boardwalk that ran along the beach had been there for decades, stretching out into the water like a forgotten relic of a bygone era. It wasn't much, just a few rusted arcade machines, a weathered carousel that hadn't spun in years, and a couple of dimly lit shops that sold overpriced trinkets to tourists. But locals didn't like to talk about it. They didn't like to walk there after dark. It was known as the silent stretch among the town's old-timers, though no one ever really explained why. Some said it was haunted, but that wasn't the whole story. It was worse than that. Lily had grown up in that town and had heard the whispers her entire life, but she had always dismissed them until she came back home one evening after a long absence, and curiosity got the best of her. Her friends had warned her not to go down there. They told her that if she ever wanted to see the sunrise again, she'd stay far away from the boardwalk after dark. But Lily had never been one to listen to rumors. So, on a cool autumn night, when the fog had settled thick along the beach and the town was eerily quiet, she decided to take a walk on the boardwalk. It wasn't the same as it used to be. The bright lights of her childhood had all but disappeared, replaced by a dull, grayish glow that seemed to pulse from the streetlights. The rusted machines in the arcade stood silent, abandoned. The carousel, which had once been filled with cheerful children, now stood motionless, its faded horses frozen mid-gallop. It was as if the entire place had been forgotten by time itself. The further she walked, the more unsettled she felt. Her breath came out in cold puffs, her footsteps echoing loudly against the wooden planks. She told herself it was nothing, just the wind, just the isolation. But the feeling didn't go away. In fact, it grew stronger, like an oppressive weight hanging over her. As she walked past the arcade, she heard something, a faint, shuffling sound. At first, she thought it was a stray animal, but the noise was too deliberate, too slow. Lily turned to look, her heart pounding in her chest. Her eyes scanned the darkness, but there was no one in sight. The noise stopped as soon as she looked, like it had been waiting for her to turn around. Her instincts screamed at her to leave, but her feet kept moving. She found herself at the end of the boardwalk, where the railing stopped and the pier stretched out over the water. The fog had thickened here, curling around the old wooden beams like something alive. The sound of the waves crashing against the pillars was muffled, distant, as though they were coming from another world entirely. Suddenly she heard it again, footsteps, not just behind her this time, but all around her. They were slow, dragging, like something was following her, stepping just out of sight. The sound of shuffling grew louder, and she felt a cold chill crawl down her spine. Her blood ran cold. She turned quickly, searching the fog for any sign of movement. Nothing, just shadows and the eerie stillness. That's when she saw it, a figure, barely visible through the fog, standing at the far end of the boardwalk. The figure was tall, too tall, and it stood perfectly still. At first, it appeared to be a person, but there was something wrong about the way it stood. Unnatural, almost inhuman. The figure was cloaked in darkness, its form twisting and shifting like the fog around it. The more she looked, the more she realized it wasn't just standing, it was waiting. Lily froze. Her mind screamed at her to run, to turn and escape, but her legs wouldn't move. She couldn't tear her eyes away from it. The figure slowly raised a hand, pointing toward her. Then, in a voice that wasn't a voice at all, more like a thought in her mind, she heard it. "You shouldn't have come back." The fog thickened, swirling around her like tendrils, and the figure started moving toward her. It glided, its limbs contorting in unnatural ways, its movement erratic and wrong. The closer it came, the more distorted it became, as if its form was being pulled and twisted by the fog itself. Lily stumbled backward, panic rising in her chest. She wanted to scream, but the sound wouldn't come. Her breath was shallow, her heart pounding in her throat. Every part of her screamed to run, but she couldn't tear her gaze away from the figure that was now almost upon her. It stopped just inches from her, its form no longer resembling a person at all. It was as though it had never been human to begin with, just a shifting mass of shadows, eyes gleaming from the darkness. And then, in a voice that sounded like 1,000 whispers layered on top of each other, it spoke again. "You never leave." Lily's body froze, her mind going blank. The world around her seemed to dissolve into the fog until there was only the sound of that voice, and then nothing. The next morning, the townspeople found the boardwalk exactly as it had been. Silent, abandoned. Nothing unusual had happened, and yet the air felt different. The fog never lifted that day. Lily was never seen again, but the boardwalk remained just as it had always been, old, crumbling, forgotten. And if you walked there after dark, if you listened carefully enough, you could hear the faint sound of footsteps, always following you, never letting you leave. And every now and then, you might glimpse a figure standing at the end of the boardwalk, waiting.
Story number 10.
It was late into the summer when Sarah and her friends decided to visit the coastal town that had long been whispered about among locals, the kind of place where people only stayed for a night or two and rarely came back. It wasn't a tourist spot, nor was it even a place you just stumble upon. It was off the beaten path, nestled between rocky cliffs and thick woods, with a boardwalk that stretched out to the edge of the sea. There were no fancy hotels or motels. Instead, small, run-down cottages dotted the town, many of them abandoned or barely standing. The town itself was quiet, eerily so. It was as if the place had been forgotten by time, left in a perpetual state of decay. Sarah and her friends had always been drawn to places with strange histories, and this one was no different. The locals didn't talk much, except to warn them to stay off the boardwalk after dark. The few people they spoke with gave them odd, sidelong glances when the boardwalk was mentioned, and when asked why, they would simply say, "It's not safe." But Sarah was curious. She brushed off the warnings, thinking they were just superstitions. After all, this was a small town, and small towns often held on to their own bizarre customs and legends. On the second night of their stay, after a dinner of bland seafood and awkward conversation with the locals, Sarah and her group decided to take a walk along the boardwalk. The sun was just beginning to dip beneath the horizon, casting long shadows over the wooden planks that creaked beneath their feet. The air was thick with the smell of salt water, and the sound of the waves crashing in the distance was oddly muffled, like something was absorbing the sound. The boardwalk was just as the locals had described it, old, weathered, and half-finished. Parts of it had been swallowed up by the sea over the years, and in other places, the wood had begun to splinter and rot, making the path treacherous to walk on. Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, though she couldn't put her finger on it. As they walked further out, the area became quieter, the houses behind them disappearing into the darkness. It felt like the boardwalk went on forever, stretching out into the water, almost as if it had no end. There were no lights, no street lamps, only the dim glow of the moon reflecting off the ocean. The wind picked up, whipping Sarah's hair across her face, but she didn't mind. She was determined to experience this place for herself. Her friends were laughing, chatting, but Sarah noticed something. Every now and then, she would catch a glimpse of movement just at the corner of her eye, something darting between the shadows, something too quick to be real, yet too definite to ignore. She paused, looking back over her shoulder, but there was nothing there. "Did you guys see that?" Sarah asked, her voice suddenly tight. "What? See what?" Her friend Emily replied, glancing back at her. "I don't know, something moved." "In the shadows," Sarah said, a knot forming in her stomach. Emily laughed. "You're just scaring yourself. Come on, let's keep walking." Sarah didn't reply. She was still scanning the boardwalk, her unease growing, but there was nothing visible at least. They continued down the path, the sound of their footsteps echoing eerily in the silence. Then, without warning, Sarah heard it, a faint, scraping sound, like fingernails dragged across wood. She stopped again, her heart pounding in her chest. Her friends were still ahead of her, talking amongst themselves, oblivious to the growing tension around Sarah. She turned slowly, but there was no one there. Just the dark stretch of boardwalk, the endless sea, and the deep shadows beyond. The scraping sound came again, louder this time. Then a thud, a soft, wet thud. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She stepped back, her feet suddenly frozen in place. Her mind raced with the thought that maybe it was just an animal, a raccoon, or something scuttling in the distance. But the sound didn't make sense for that. It wasn't an animal, it was something deliberate. And then, as if to answer her thoughts, the air grew colder. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up. She felt it. Something was watching her. Without thinking, Sarah turned and sprinted down the boardwalk, her friends calling after her, but she couldn't stop. She didn't know why, but she had to get away. She had to leave whatever was behind her. Her heart raced in her chest as she ran, the sound of her feet pounding against the rotting wood. And then, suddenly, there was a sharp scream, a terrible, guttural sound that echoed across the water. Sarah skidded to a stop, her stomach churning as she glanced over her shoulder. And then she saw it. A figure emerging from the shadows of the boardwalk, just beyond the reach of the moonlight. It was tall, unnaturally tall, and its body seemed to shift, flickering between the light and dark like it wasn't entirely there. The air around it shimmered, distorting the world like a heat haze. Its face was covered by a mask, but its eyes glowed with an unnatural light, piercing the darkness. It didn't move like a person. It dragged itself along the boardwalk, scraping its body along the decaying wood. Each movement was jerky, unnatural, as if it were made of something else, something that shouldn't exist. "Run!" Sarah screamed to her friends. They turned, but the boardwalk seemed to stretch on endlessly before them. No matter how much they ran, it felt like they were trapped, like the world had changed around them. The figure started toward them, its body twisting unnaturally, but it wasn't walking. It was gliding, sliding along the boards, its head slowly tilting to one side, as if it was studying them. The scraping sound filled the air, sharp and grating, like nails on a chalkboard. And then, in the blink of an eye, the thing was gone. One moment it was there, and the next, it vanished into the mist that had begun to roll in from the ocean. The silence that followed was suffocating. No one spoke. They ran the rest of the way back to their cabin, never once looking behind them. That night, no one slept, and the next morning they packed up their things and left the town as quickly as they could, never once mentioning what had happened. But Sarah would never forget the figure, the thing that had been waiting for them in the shadows of the boardwalk. And whenever she closed her eyes, she still heard it, the scraping, slow and deliberate, always closer than before.